Good afternoon. I'm Leah Teague. I'm professor at Baylor Law School and the director of our leadership program. We want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. I know this is going to be a delightful hour that will fly by. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce Talmage Boston, who will be conducting the interview of award-winning historian David Stewart, who's agreed to be with us to talk to us about the leadership journey of our first president. But first, a quick introduction to our program, which is part of our nationally recognized professional development program, as well as our innovative leadership development program. Since about half of the audience there are students, I want to say thank you for being here. Appreciate all you're doing in these challenging times. But I also want to let everyone know that we have a number of guests who are joining us today. We are thrilled to have not only a significant number of our own graduates, our Baylor Law alumni, but we have others who come to us from the leadership space, legal educators who are around the nation and part of a national movement to make law students and lawyers more aware of the important role that lawyers have traditionally played throughout history as leaders in society. This is a topic that is near and dear to Talmage as it is to us. Talmage has written much on the topic, including his book that's entitled Raising the Bar, the Critical Role of the Lawyer in Society. And in this book, he makes the case that lawyers have played critical roles in the founding and the leading of our nation. And in that book and in every other writing and speech that I've heard him give on leadership and professionalism, he issues a call for our profession to truly raise the bar by embracing our role as leaders. Another one of his books is Cross-Examining History. A lawyer gets answers from the experts about our presidents. And in that book, he offers lesson after lesson learned from his study of American presidents. And today's interview continues with this topic as he interviews author David Stewart on his latest book on George Washington. It was through this mutual commitment to encouraging and equipping lawyers as leaders that we first met Talmage. And although Talmage is not a Baylor lawyer, he is a dear friend, so I certainly count him as one of us. We so appreciate his partnering with us on a number of programs such as this that focus on leadership. And today's session promises to be as informative and as inspiring as all the others. Now, if you look at Talmage's impressive list of published works, you might miss the fact that he is also a distinguished trial lawyer. He's currently a partner in Dallas with Shackelford, Bowen, McKinley, and Norton. But he's also a very important influencer within the State Bar of Texas. In 2019, Talmage received the prestigious Terry Lee Grantham Memorial Award, which is one of the most prestigious awards given by the Texas Bar Foundation each year. So he is indeed a leader among lawyers. Now, another interesting fun fact about Talmage, he also loves history, loves baseball, has two books where those intersect. But since the sport of baseball was before Washington's time, and we're not here to talk about the athletic prowess of our founding father, George Washington, let's get on with the program for today, which is to learn leadership lessons about our first president. So I have watched Talmage give these interviews. I know that you're going to be in for a treat. And I just want you to know that if we welcome questions, please submit those to us in the chat and Talmage, and we'll be watching those. And students, please turn on your cameras, but I also encourage you to put it in speakers mode so that you are watching our speaker and not shifting back and forth. So Talmage, thank you so much for once again arranging an incredible author to be with us. And we look forward to your remarks. Now, I will tell you at the very end, I'm going to pop back in to thank our speaker, but also to do a drawing for one of you lucky individuals in attendance today. You're going to get an autographed copy of our book. So with that, Talmage, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Leah. Thank you, Baylor Law School and all the good people there and students and alumni and everybody tuning in. What a great thrill it is for me to do a program with my good friend, David Stewart. And David is truly a leader among lawyers as a leading historian who came out of the legal profession. David is a graduate of Yale Law School. He clerked for Lewis Powell on the United States Supreme Court. He had a distinguished track record as a commercial litigator in Washington, D.C., argued 2 cases in the United States Supreme Court, including one against a guy named Ken Starr. But anyway, David, about 10 or 12 years ago, decided that what he really wanted to do was be a historian. And he's such a fantastic researcher and writer that he's had quite a bit of success. His first book was on the Constitutional Convention of 1787. His second book was on the impeachment trial of Alexander Johnson. Of Andrew Johnson, who followed Lincoln. I'm thinking about Hamilton, sorry. And his third book was on the treason trial of Aaron Burr. His fourth book was called Madison's Gift, a biography of James Madison. And this is his fifth history book, as Leah showed you, on George Washington, that came out earlier this year and has already won a major national award from the Order of Cincinnati. So David has taken all of his legal skills and training and use them for the good of our record of history. So David, thanks for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Talmage and Leah.
All right, so David, obviously there have been thousands of biographies written about George Washington that pursue all kinds of angles on him. But in your new book, what you've really pursued, and the subtitle is The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, you've zeroed in on his mastery of politics. So what led you to that angle on our first president?
Well, I got to Washington because I was, I've done these other books on the founders, and I found people always wanted to ask me who was the most important one, and the answer was always Washington. And after I gave that answer enough times, it seemed to me that maybe I'd been missing the point, and I really ought to look into Washington. And I was struck, as others have been, by the fact that he won 4 major elections in his life. He was elected Commander-in-Chief of the Army by the Continental Congress. He was elected President of the Constitutional Convention. He was elected our first president and then reelected. And those are great achievements, but what really stands out is he won them unanimously. And you don't do that with box tops. That's a remarkable achievement. It's inconceivable today. But it was pretty inconceivable even in the 18th century. It just didn't happen. So I wanted to understand, how did this guy do it? Because, we don't think of him as a political actor. We don't think of him as a politician. Politicians are sort of grimy people we dislike. And this great hero of our nation really was a terrific politician. And I came to the conclusion that it's not politicians that are the problem, it's bad politicians who are the problem. What we need are good ones.
Now, as we've talked about, your first book was about the Constitutional Convention. And then a later book was a biography of James Madison. And so obviously both of those are integrally connected to a biography of George Washington. So how helpful was the prior researching and thinking that you had done on those 2 books to helping zero in on George Washington?
It was great because the overall sequence of events I knew real well, and I knew that a lot of the leading characters. My particular focus turned out to be to force me to learn a lot of new stuff, because I became persuaded that actually as a young man, he had terrible political instincts and really sort of undermined himself repeatedly. And he realized that. He was a great one for self-examination and realized that he was doing a lousy job and decided to try to figure out how to do better. And he spent a lot of years really as an apprentice politician and learning how to be more effective at the job he was taking on. So that meant I had to focus on this period nobody looks at, which is between the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. He didn't do anything heroic then, but he did figure out himself and how to influence people and how to be a great political actor. And I think that really merits a lot of study, and I found it fascinating.
Mhm. Now, as you say early on in the book, quote, from his earliest days, Washington hungered for distinction, and his goal was renown, which sounds a whole lot like the statement that Abraham Lincoln made at age 23 about his ambition to become worthy of renown. So what put that kind of driving ambition into Washington's DNA at such a young age?
It's one of those things that's hard to excavate into. He had an older half brother, Lawrence, who appears to have been just as ambitious a young man. He died young. So the Washingtons, they had that in them, but he had four other brothers who didn't have it, and were content with very quiet lives. So he was just, a person who had that fire inside him. And he was set at an early age. He set himself on a course to achieve greatly. And, he always said that the most important thing to him was his reputation, was what people thought of him. And, that's not, what we might think of today as wanting to be a celebrity or an influencer. That wasn't what he was after. He wanted to be someone you knew about because he was worth knowing about, because he had done important things. And that was the driving force for his entire career.
And to put some specifics into that about this incredible ambition at a very young age, before reaching age 20, you say that he combined a gentleman's manner with a toughness earned surveying, and that he had a, quote, quiet confidence, and he became a Virginia military major commanding the colony's southern district. He already owned 4,000 acres in the West. He'd written a journal that was published about dealing with threatening French and Indians on the American frontier. And the booklet went viral and circulated all around the colonies and abroad. So that's a perfect image and achievements for anyone to aspire to. And he had them as a teenager. So how did he connect the dots about what needed to be done to gain distinction and renown at such a young age?
Well, he really was a star right out of the box. He was, and some of that's going to be luck. Not everybody gets the best opportunities. He got some great opportunities, and you have basic gifts. He was taller than everybody he met. He was a great natural athlete, and he had presence. I'm not sure that's something you can teach. You can learn to keep your mouth shut when you don't know anything. That was something he always preached. Don't shoot your mouth off when you don't know what you're talking about. But he had an ability to connect with people in an easy manner, which was very effective. He had great physical gifts, which meant that when he went on this very grueling expedition out into what was then the West, it was the forests of Western Pennsylvania, he could survive it. He had adventures that James Fenimore Cooper tried to write about, and except Washington's were better written and more exciting. So he brought some natural talents, and he got lucky in the sense that he was connected to the Fairfax family. It never hurts to keep an eye out for people who can help you. And the Fairfaxes lived next door to the Washington land at what became Mount Vernon. His elder brother Lawrence had married into the Fairfax family, always told him, stay close to these people. They're the richest people around. And they were. They owned most of Northern Virginia. Their holdings were the equivalent of the state of New Hampshire. And they became so smitten with him, he won their loyalty, that they sponsored him. And that's how he got these early assignments where he was able to distinguish himself. So it was a pretty rare combination of inner talents, of keeping an eye on the main chance, and some luck, which allowed him to really make a remarkable start. He really was a comet his first couple of years in the public eye.
Yeah.
And then it all went south.
And it went south. And as you said a minute ago, after it went south, particularly during the French and Indian War, he kind of took stock of his mistakes and essentially made the commitment not to repeat them. And for the most part, he didn't. So as you also said a minute ago, in this 16 or 17 years between the end of his service in the French and Indian War and the time he took on as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775 in the Revolutionary War, during those years, he was a businessman, he was a legislator, he was a judge, and he was a community leader. And so, and you say this is really kind of the focus of your book, that during these years when he wasn't doing things that made him well known and recognized, that's really when the education took hold of him that led to the great achievements over the last 20 some odd years of his life. So what were the most important things that happened to him during that period in terms of advancing him toward his goal of achieving renown?
It was everything you talked about, which gave him a chance to learn about himself and how he could lead. Leadership is leadership in any organization, in any group of people. I had a great exchange last week with a former senior general in the Army who's also studying George Washington for kind of the same reason. And, he said, he thinks his time organizing the plantation at Mount Vernon and building, his flower business, which was very successful, was important. I mean, those are organizational and logistical skills that he developed. He had to manage his workforce. It's always controversial because most of it was enslaved, but it was an important skill to develop. And his time in public life as a legislator, he was a legislator 5 years longer than he was a soldier. People don't focus on that. And he was not a naturally gifted legislator. He was not well educated. He'd only had 2 or 3 years of formal education. He was very self-conscious about that. He read a lot on his own to try to catch up, but it was hard to do. He was a poor speaker, and this was an age when being an orator was really your ticket to political fame, and Washington couldn't do that. And he learned that he had other strengths, and he built on those. He was the hardest working man in the colonial era. He put in 12-hour days his whole life. And he also had a gift, which is not a universal gift. Those of us who are older know this. There are often very smart people who just can't really get stuff done. And Washington could get things done. He had an executive frame of mind, an executive manner, a gift with people to get them to do what he thought they should do. And he developed that. And he, in the House of Burgesses, which is the legislature there, he became known as someone who could get things done, even if he wasn't going to give a good speech or any speech. He tried to avoid it. And his time actually as a judge was very important because the job at the time, he presided over cases and learned about people's problems, how they go wrong, and also had to decide the cases collegially with his fellow justices. But he also had local government responsibilities. regulating the tobacco trade, and approving roads and building ferry service. So he learned again how people interact with government, how government can help, and how government can get in the way. And it all built a guy who understood how you lead. And by the time he gets to the Continental Congress, he's 43. And he's just a different person. He had been a very brash, self-important, sometimes sarcastic guy who was disrespectful of his superiors at times. That was all gone.
Now, getting to the Revolutionary War, and he took over as commander-in-chief in 1775, and he continued on even after the surrender at Yorktown. But during all that time, he essentially never won a battle. And yet throughout that time period, he maintained his status as a hero to the American people. And there were a couple of mild challenges to his leadership, but he found a way to maintain it. So how do you explain his maintaining this heroic stature as the head of an army that doesn't win any battles?
Well, you're a little harsh. He won a couple of battles, but he did not win more than he lost. That's certainly true. And it was, again, a combination of things. He always made it clear that he cared about his soldiers and was engaged with them and led them in a way that was personal. I wrote about Valley Forge, which was the terrible winter they spent there. And, every day he would ride through the camp and face up to just the misery that his soldiers were facing and try to make it better. It might be little things, but he would do what he could, and they knew he was trying. And that was very important. He also had an extraordinary level of personal bravery. And that just can't be replicated. It's either in you or it isn't. At least that's my impression. And he was at battle after battle where he was the tallest man, often seated on the tallest horse, a perfect target. And he never flinched. He never even appeared to think about the fact that he was at risk. And he never got a scratch. I mentioned luck earlier. That's clearly luck. But bravery is something we admire. Moral courage and also physical courage. And that was part of it. I also have to say, there were senior officers who thought they could be better at commander-in-chief than he was. And he pretty much got rid of them. He didn't have total power. He had to work with Congress. He had to pick his timing. But there were 3 or 4 people who took a run at him, and they never got anywhere. He was very good at political infighting and, frankly, not leaving fingerprints. Generally, you knew it had to have been him, but you couldn't really prove it.
Yeah, in fact, on that bravery point, the number of horses that were shot out from under him, the number of bullet holes that they found in his hat and in his uniform. So make no mistake about it, he was in the thick of the fighting. And as you say, miraculously survived. And as you also say in the book, even the Indians saw him as some kind of child of destiny that somehow would never be hurt, which kind of reminds me that basically the same thing happened to Ulysses Grant in the Civil War.
Lucky is great.
I'd rather be lucky than good. But let's go into the details about Valley Forge, because we've heard about that all our lives. And your book paints a real vivid picture that I think is worth everybody's hearing to understand, what it took to hold the group together during that winter. Well,
they'd had a bad year. That was the year they didn't win any battles in 1777. So that's depressing for an army. And their supply services completely broke down. So they were in this camp with not enough food. They would go for, some of the soldiers would go for 5, 6, 7 days without really any material food. They would get no meat, no fish, little bit of bread, and that was it. And they were sick. They were just miserably sick. They had dysentery, which we won't talk about any further. They got scabies, which was a skin thing that was horrible. They had smallpox like crazy, just spread through the camp. And it's worth mentioning, and given the times we're in, Washington ultimately required that his soldiers get vaccinated. They had a way to vaccinate against smallpox. It was not without risk. The medical people of the day were not all that precise. But if you wanted to be a soldier, you had to get vaccinated. So just basic hygiene, sick, depressed people are not good at cleaning up after themselves. And it was a real problem. And of course, that just bred more disease. And it was cold.
It was so cold.
Yeah, it
a lot
was
of these guys
really
didn't
cold.
have shoes. They didn't have shoes. They didn't have coats. I mean, I wonder how they all didn't freeze to death of hypothermia.
Well, I think they were, to be blunt, I think they were tougher than we are. But also, a lot of them died. I think it was something like 20% of them died. And a lot of them had to go home because they were too sick to fight. And it was a terrible experience. And it really tested him. He had to reinvent the Army. He had to recreate supply services, the Quartermaster Corps, the Clothier General, which is a wonderful office description, but they needed blankets, they needed uniforms, and they didn't have them.
Well, one of the great points you make is Washington's calling and sending all kinds of messages to the Congress to tell them about how horrible things are at Valley Forge. They're ignoring them. And so talk about how he ended up solving that problem.
Yeah, Congress was superior to him, and he always accepted that. He saw Congress as the sovereign, and he had been not a good subordinate in the French and Indian War, and he never repeated that mistake. So he would write them strong letters, but not disrespectful letters. And he finally realized, they're sitting in warm rooms. They don't understand how bad it is here. So he asked that they send a committee to study the problems of the Army. And this is a time there were often 16, 17, 18 congressmen. That was all that actually showed up. And they sent a committee of 6. And there were some friends of his on the committee and some people who didn't like him. And it was a terrific exposure that he didn't have to point out the problems that the soldiers had. The congressional delegates saw it. They just rode through camp and, it broke their hearts. And they wrote home moving letters about how terrible it was. And that just opened the door for Washington. He presented what he thought needed to be done. He didn't get everything, but he got most of what he wanted. And he was able to rebuild the Army with congressional support. And a key element was that he made them look at it in the eye themselves.
Now, of course, when the revolution was over and the Americans had miraculously won, there's always, in any conversation about the greatness of Washington as a leader, one of his most heroic traits was his willingness to turn over his power. That there was no effort to stay on. And so people marveled at that. And then later, of course, at the end of his second term, he could have easily had a third term. He didn't want it. So what's the historical importance of that in terms of setting a precedent as well as a statement about his character?
Well, it's tremendously important for the nation. A lot of revolutions end up with the guy who's in charge of the Army sort of taking the revolution in a different direction. You know, Oliver Cromwell did that in England. Napoleon did that in France. We've seen that in the 20th and 21st centuries. You know, you have a revolution, you think you're going to change everything, but oops, it doesn't. So Washington understood that it couldn't be just one guy on a white horse. And what was even better was, frankly, he didn't want to be the one guy on the white horse. At the end of the Revolutionary War, he wanted to go home. He was tired of being the person everybody leaned on. So it fit his attitude. I think he also understood that, again, if he wanted to support, if he wanted to support it, build his reputation, that would be a key element, that he was not power mad, that it was okay with him to give somebody else a turn. And it gave him tremendous credibility with the early Americans that, you know, okay, this is a guy we can trust because he's not desperate for it. So we can trust him to exercise power.
Mhm.
And for his career, I think it was a tremendous advantage. I don't think that's why he did it. I think he did it for his own reasons and because he thought it would be good for the nation. He did not really want to be president, but he recognized, I think he was an honest guy who looked around and saw the other candidates and thought, well, I'm no worse than they are, and was willing to do it.
Yeah. Now, after the revolution, and of course, after he resigned from the service, the country went downhill rapidly, in large part because the Articles of Confederation gave so little power to the federal government. And everyone knew that this was going to continue to decline, and maybe the whole thing would go up in smoke unless there was a new constitution to be the supreme law of the land that would give the federal government some real power. And so, as you mentioned, Washington was unanimously chosen to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. And so, speculate a little, David, had Washington declined Madison's request and said, no, I don't want to go to that convention, and no, I don't want to be the chairman. How do you think that would have impacted what they did in Philadelphia?
Well, you know, the what if history is pretty tough. You just don't really know. But, you know, my gut feeling would be that it doesn't happen. You just don't even get enough delegates showing up with it. And actually, Madison writes him. He says, unless you're coming, we're not going to have enough people. And because he had tried to have a convention in the fall of the previous year in Annapolis, Maryland, and you know, they only got 13 delegates from 5 states. So that, you know, they've been down that road. He needed the big guy. And I think Washington recognized that too. So, you know, the speculation at the time was that the country was going to fall apart, that we were going to end up with maybe 3 different countries. The New England states and the Middle Atlantic states and the Southern states, and maybe even a 4th nation out past the Appalachian Mountains. And, you know, people like James Monroe, there were a number of leaders who really thought that's where we were going. So I don't think that's far-fetched. I think that might very well have happened.
Now, in recent years, thanks in large part to Ron Chernow and Lin-Manuel Miranda, there's been a national obsession with Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. And of course, there's always been some kind of an obsession with Thomas Jefferson, who was Washington's Secretary of State, who's always had a huge following because of authoring the Declaration of Independence and, of course, as president, the Louisiana Purchase. And those two guys, per the musical, per history, were with each day became worse and worse enemies. And here they are, both members of Washington's Congress, and he's trying to preside as president. So visualize a situation where there's those two guys, Hamilton and Jefferson, and Washington in the room as kind of mediator, facilitator, umpire, whatever we want to call it. How do you think that personal dynamic played out when there was a neutral third party to try to bring at least a little bit of harmony into the situation?
Honestly, I think he probably mostly listened. He liked having smart people around. He always recruited smart people to advise him. He would make up his own mind, but he wanted to hear what everybody else thought, or at least the people he respected. And he thought Hamilton and Jefferson were really smart, and he was right. And I think their cabinet meetings were contentious. And actually, Jefferson wrote despairingly of what they were like, because I think Washington didn't shut anybody up, which meant that Hamilton just talked and talked and talked, which was his trademark. And Jefferson didn't like to get in arguments. It's an interesting trait for a politician, but he actually hated them. When he was president, he would have dinners, but he would only have people from one party at each dinner because he didn't want to have arguments in front of him. So he would say what he thought. He was no coward, but he wouldn't, after 10 or 15 minutes, you've usually said what you have on your mind, and Hamilton would keep going. And I think mostly Washington was willing to listen. I mean, if he thought it got out of bounds, he would, I'm sure, step in. But that was an important part of his thinking process, was hearing other people's ideas and deciding, did that make sense? Or, maybe I should think about it a different way. And I think those are probably fascinating meetings. And I'm not sure we've ever had as good cabinet meetings since.
One of Washington's great political triumphs during his presidency was the compromise of 1790. So David, explain to our audience exactly what it was and what Washington's role was in making the deal, in which both Hamilton and Jefferson were heavily involved.
Well, there were two big issues facing Congress and the government, which one was, where would the national capital be? Which, it's important to remember, we were just a new country. We didn't really have any history as a country. And what history we had, what unifying symbol we had, was basically George Washington. There wasn't really much else. People in South Carolina didn't know anybody from New England. People from Pennsylvania had never left the state. I mean, it was a very different place from what we have now. And they wanted a national capital that would unify the country. And they fought about it for something like 13 years without coming to an agreement. I think there were 7 or 8 different cities who served as temporary capital during the war and then afterwards. And so that's one major issue, is what's going to be the capital that expresses our union, our commitment to self-government. And they decided they wanted a new capital, a new city. The other issue, of course, was, how do you pay for the war? And that's the issue that always comes up after a war, is how do you pay for the thing? It's always more money than you had, and you always borrowed money to pay for it. And you got to figure out how you're going to pay it back. And the debts we had were crushing. As a nation, our economy was in the dumpster. It was the worst depression we'd ever had, and worse than the 1930s. So those two issues had to be addressed. And Hamilton wanted to take over the state debts. We had federal debts and state debts. He wanted the federal government to take over the state debts. A lot of people didn't like that. It was going to be extra money, and there were bad states. Let them pay their own debts. If your state had paid your debts, you didn't want to do that. And then there were 5 different places where there might be a national capital. And some wanted it in Baltimore because it had a good port and it was a slave state, and that would be good for Southerners. Other people wanted it in Pennsylvania because it wasn't a slave state, and that would be, and they People in Pennsylvania wanted to be rewarded. That was a big state. So that became, everybody could tell, okay, we're going to have to make a compromise with these two big issues. And nobody could make it happen. They tried for months. And if you listen to the musical by Miranda, which is very much adopts the view taken by Chernow, and I will admit most historians, it was all resolved at a dinner that Jefferson had with Hamilton and Madison, and they agreed that the national capital would go on the Potomac River, what we have as Washington, D.C., and that the federal government would assume the debts of the states. I find that implausible. Both Hamilton and Jefferson worked for Washington. They were in his cabinet. He appointed them. They answered to him, and it was clear from their descriptions of their jobs that they really did answer to him. And if they didn't do something he liked, they had to change it. And if you look closely, you find indications that Washington personally intervened in some of the negotiations. And finally, if you step back, there's a principle of historical interpretation called, in Latin, cui bono. I don't know how to pronounce Latin, so I may have it wrong. But the question is, who benefits? You can tell who's behind something by who benefits. And the capital went on the Potomac River, which Washington wanted and Jefferson wanted. They assumed the debts of the states, which Washington wanted and Hamilton wanted. So who got everything he wanted? Washington. So why don't we think Washington was behind this? And I'm happy to believe that Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison got together for dinner one night. But our account of what happened there is totally written by Thomas Jefferson, who was a great one for writing memos to himself about all the wonderful things he had done. And I just don't quite believe it. I mean, I really think they were doing what Washington told them to do. And, you know, he got what he wanted. And he didn't feel the need to take credit for that in public. He didn't write memos to himself. He was just happy that the country was going to get got the right decision by according to his ideas.
Now we have a good question from our crowd, Sammy Lutz, who says, do you think Washington's plea against political parties after seeing all the disagreement in his cabinet, was that naive? Did it suggest that he misunderstood American politics on the whole?
There is a naivete to the entire Constitution. It does not account for the possibility of parties. And, you know, when Washington served in the House of Burgesses for 16 years, there were no parties there. You know, just didn't happen. And it mostly didn't happen in other colonies, although it did happen in Pennsylvania. So people weren't expecting that. But by Washington's second term, the partisan feelings had become rancorous. It was very unpleasant, and Washington was trapped in it and was caught in it. And by the end of his second term, he's a partisan. He is very enlisted in the Federalist cause, and he is very hostile to Jefferson and Madison's Democratic Republican Party. And I think when he wrote the farewell address, which is where he denounces partisanship, we need to remember that he didn't say we must have no partisanship. In fact, he said, we will always have partisanship. That's what human beings do. But we need to be sure that it is simply a flame that is tended and does not blaze out of control. We can't let it become what controls what happens. And that's a balance that's not easy to strike, because when you're in the thick of the fray, it's kind of hard to say, oh, I should politely let him get his way. But that moderation was a principle of his. He didn't always respect it himself, I'd have to say, but he understood its importance and articulated it. And it's something we need to keep in mind too. I've spent a number of years talking about these books about the founding of the country and saying, well, it was just as bad before. I'm not so sure anymore. We've run off the tracks a bit, and we should, Washington was a little bit telling us all, do as I say, not as I do. And he's right. We should do as he says.
Now, going back to the Compromise 1790, another question from the audience from Katie about Hamilton's motivation behind assuming the state debts. What was that also tied to his desire that the banks would be in New York, where he was?
I'm not sure I would put it on New York because there was a big bank in Philadelphia, and that's where at least the interim capital would be for the first 10 years. But it certainly was Hamilton's desire to have the rich people in the country, and he had a very practical view that the rich people really matter in more than others do. He wanted them completely committed to the federal government, and those were the people who held the state debts. They were bondholders who had purchased the debts, often at tremendous discounts. And he wanted them to be looking to the federal government, to want the federal government to succeed, and also to support federal taxes, because that was the way they would get paid. It was a very sort of practical politician attitude, and that was his analysis. And, he was right.
Now, after Washington left the presidency and returned to Mount Vernon, he had, as it turned out, only 2.5 years left to live. And during that time, one of his major challenges was wrestling with his conscience over what to do about his slaves. So talk about how he wrestled with it and what he ultimately decided.
Well, it was a wrestling match that had started during the war. Before the war, up to his 40s, there's really no evidence that he felt bad about slavery. Maybe he did, but he didn't tell anyone. During the war, he does. He is troubled by the fact there are Black soldiers who are dying for his liberty, and he can see that owning them is wrong, is a crime. He resolves to become a good slave owner, and I think he discovered pretty quickly that that was an oxymoron, that there is no good slave owner. You're still own people. And in the late 1780s, he starts on a plan, and he did talk to 3 or 4 close, intimate friends, and only them, to try to figure out a way to get out of owning slaves. Of course, he didn't want to lose a lot of money at it. He was always anxious about money. And it was complicated because at Mount Vernon, he owned more than 100 people by himself on his own, but an even larger number of the slaves at Mount Vernon were owned technically by the estate of Martha's first husband. And this is where lawyers can put on their thinking caps, because under the property law at the time, those enslaved people actually belonged, if they belonged to anybody, to the beneficiaries of that will, which were Martha's grandchildren, and they were alive. There were 4 of them. And so if Washington was going to free them, he had to buy them out of the estate at fair prices. That was his legal duty, and also his ethical duty to these children whom he had raised. So that was hard. He didn't have the money. He tried to raise it. He owned a lot of land. It had been a passion of his to acquire land, about 50,000 acres. And he went through a number of schemes to sell it or to lease it or to just find somebody to, give him some money for it. And he spent almost a decade trying to do that. And finally, when he's in retirement, he basically gives up on that he's just never going to make that work. And all that he has the power to do, he does not have the power to release the custis slaves, which belong to the estate. And that's a heartache, because many of them have intermarried with the slaves he owned. So he's potentially busting up families by freeing his slaves, but he's gonna do something. So he rewrites his will, and this just a few months before he dies, and he provides in explicit, very mandatory terms that his slaves will be released, and he leaves enough money to pay for them. It's education of the younger ones, to teach them trades, and to for the older ones to support them in their retirement. And the last payment is made some 30, 35 years after his death. I mean, the estate was a burden. And he does free all of the slaves he owned, and that's as much as he can do. And there is a tendency to wonder, was he trying to set a standard for other slave owners? I think he would have liked that if he had, but I think he was a hard-headed guy who understood that that was very unlikely. Too many of the people he knew, and he knew a lot of people who owned slaves, their wealth was tied up in that, and they just felt like they couldn't afford to without destroying their standard of living. So I think it was an act of personal penance. He said at one point in a letter to a friend, "I hope my maker will not find this inappropriate." And I think he didn't want to leave this life without trying to fix what he could fix.
Yeah. Now we have a question from Jackson Wells in the crowd. He says, is there a specific person who stood out as a confidant or mentor to Washington and influenced his decision-making?
It's a complicated answer. As a young man, this Colonel Fairfax, who lived next door to him and was the central figure in the Fairfax family, was a mentor. He even wrote a scolding letter once, and clearly took George in hand and tried to be a father figure for him. George's father died when he was 11. As a mature person, he developed people he trusted who he thought were smart. For a while, it was this another neighbor, George Mason, who was a very thoughtful political, really, theorist. It became James Madison. Even though Madison was 20-some years younger, he thought Madison was just the smartest thing on two legs, and he really relied on him for a number of years until they disagreed on political issues. During the war, there were a couple of advisors, Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, whom he really trusted and would pay a lot of attention to what they recommended. So it changed with the circumstance and the situation. And he was a headstrong young man. He was not a headstrong, mature individual. And he would always consult and try to hear views of the people he respected.
Now, for my final question, which ties into one from Blake Bryan in the audience, David, you end the book talking about how knowing George Washington's life story, and particularly knowing about his political rise, has helped crystallize the most important traits for a master politician. And this ties into Nathaniel Philbrick's column on the back of your book, which says, by focusing on the political genius of George Washington, David Stewart has produced an important new portrait of our first president. Stewart demonstrates time and again with vivid prose that great leaders are also great learners. And in this time of division and turmoil, this is the book we need. So what about Washington, and knowing the specifics can help us bridge this gap, even by any extent, given how polarized our society is.
Yeah, there was to Washington a basic modesty about his own views. I think of the Constitutional Convention. He went there really wanting three things. He wanted the federal government to be able to levy taxes, which under the Articles of Confederation had proved impossible because every state had to endorse it, and that never happened. He wanted there to be an executive branch, which we didn't have under the Articles of Confederation. And he wanted the federal government to be able to reverse actions by the states, that it would be superior. Because he said, without those elements, we just don't have a government. And that was it. And the rest of the stuff that the other 54 delegates spent the summer arguing about, near as we can tell, he just didn't get involved with. Designing the presidency, and they all knew he would be the first president. He just, whatever they did, he was going to go along with. And there is a great power in telling the people around you and the people at large, I trust you. And you need to make a good decision here. You can't do that on everything. Sometimes a leader has to make the decision. But he was a great model for delegating decisions as well. And I think that's something we have a lot of trouble with these days, is trusting each other. And he showed us that it's okay.
All right, Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Mr. Stewart, such incredible lessons for us. An important work. We all need to pay attention to it and learn from it. And it resonated so well with me with regard to the students in our audience, because so many of our students come to law school with that fire in the belly to make a difference. And yet there's still some rough edges for all of us. So in our leadership program, really what we're trying to do is to focus on encouraging students to first be leaders of themselves, to understand that lifelong learning, and to, just as George Washington did, try to know yourself for the purposes of becoming a better person, honor, integrity, caring, those things you talk to us about. That's necessary before you can become a stronger leader, a great leader, a successful difference maker. So, oh my goodness, highly recommend all of us read this book. Now, it just so happens that Blake Bryan, it won the book. Now, I'm going to say, while we really love that students ask great questions, it's not that we're rewarding him because he was the last one to ask it. We picked his name before he asked that last question. So thanks to all of you for participating. We had almost 100 people here today. So again, thank you, Mr. Stewart. Thank you, Talmage, for being with us. And with that, Talmage, one last word. Mr. Stewart, one last word for us. Inspire our students as we leave today.
As lawyers, you really can make a difference in everything you do. And what Ms. Teague just said in terms of honor and integrity, that if you ever give that up, you have squandered your rights and disappointed everybody. So don't do that.
I guess my final word would tie into David's life. And Leah mentioned the book I wrote, Raising the Bar, the Crucial Role of the Lawyer in Society. And lawyers can play all kinds of roles in all kinds of ways, not just in courtrooms, not just in conference rooms on transactions, but as you can see from David, to take that fine analytical thinking and apply it to a whole different discipline, in this case, American history, just as others have, applied it to politics. Or lawyers, we had John Grisham at the Leadership Symposium to writing fiction. So realize that while you're at law school developing these leadership traits, they can be applied in a wide variety of ways and fields. And so I hope that you'll just keep developing them and see where life takes you as to how you can use them.
Thank you so much. Students and alumni and friends, be brave, be bold, use our education, our training, and our position in society to do good. Until we see you again, thank you again so much.